Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of The Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at The Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the SafeCamp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of SafeCamp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web or at SafeCamp Audio on social media. On this week's episode, we talked to Gretchen Sisson, who is a sociologist studying abortion and adoption in the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Sciences at University of California, San Francisco. Sisson's research on mothers who chose to relinquish their rights into private adoptions led her to write Relinquished, The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood. We talked about that research, her book on it, and what both experiences have led her to believe about the framework and very existence of adoption in America. So without further ado, here is our conversation with Gretchen Sisson. We are joined by Gretchen Sisson, author of the recently published book, Relinquished, The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood, to talk about what her research on mothers who choose to relinquish their rights into private adoptions and how that informed her own view. She's also more than an author. She's a sociologist studying abortion and adoption at the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. So, Ms. Sisson, thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Of course, thanks for having me.
Before we get into the weighty topics that you write about, house rules here on our podcast is you got to give the folks a favorite, one of our pop culture categories. Here they are for you: TV show or movie, book, musical group, or sports team. You don't have to give me all those. You can give me however many you want. Gretchen, what do you got?
Oh, well, I'll give you, so sports team makes it easy because here in San Francisco, just this past week, we had our very first WNBA game with the Golden State Valkyries. So you can actually have my Valkyrie shirt on right now, which I know our listeners can't see. But yeah. I've got my Valkyrie shirt on. And you have to mention, I'm not a big sports person, but the whole city is so excited for the Valkyries. And we are very excited to start going to these WNBA games. So I've managed to get all my kids on board, and we're excited for our first inaugural season here. So
right on, go Valkyries. So, obviously this book came out in a post-Roe America where we have, I think, 12 states that have outright banned the practice.
I think it's 14 now, but never quote me because we got a lot turning the light switches on and off. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So 12 to 14, and then another, I think 10 or so that have pretty severe limits on abortion that range from, 6 weeks to 22 weeks. But the work of this book really started like 15 years ago. Can you talk a little bit for our listeners just about the process that got you to eventually publishing this?
Yeah, so the data collection all happened during Roe. So the data collection for the book really ran from 2010 to 2020. And the adoptions that I include in the book all occurred from 2000 to 2020. It should be clear, when I started doing data collection in 2010, I did not know I was writing a book. I wasn't writing a book. Right. I was just trying to finish my dissertation and finish graduate school. And so at the time, 2010, I interviewed mothers who had relinquished children for adoption, going back to the baby scoop era before Roe v. Wade into the 1960s, and then up through 2009. So within a year of when I did the interviews. And then in 2020, I went back and re-interviewed those women who had relinquished from 2000 to 2010 and recruited a new cohort who had relinquished from 2010 to 2020. So all of this is to say that the book really covers adoptions from 2000 to 2020, including 10-year follow-up data for that cohort of women that I interviewed both times. I think that follow-up is actually really the most important core part of the book, is to understand how these adoptions carry out over that 10-year period and really over the course of their lives and their children's lives as their children grow up. Because I think that the way that adoption is so politicized in our conversations about abortion and reproductive choice and autonomy, in the ways that we view adoption as a social good to achieve family building, almost as a form of healthcare for people who are dealing with infertility, right? The ways that we want to use adoption are very present in the narratives of these mothers who have relinquished children, particularly very soon after their adoptions, because they are as immersed in this cultural milieu as the rest of us are.
Mm-hmm.
But as time went on, as they got further from their adoption, many of them came to a much more critical understanding of the conditions that led to their relinquishment and the termination of their parental rights in the first place. And that is really what I think is the most important thing the book offers.
Would you say that that experience was, nothing in the world is uniform, but as close to uniform as you would imagine it to be? I guess what I'm saying is, of all these women that you've interviewed and all the data that you've been able to see, would you say that it is overwhelmingly common that the attitude or view of an adoption by a birth parent over time sours, like you're talking about right now?
Yes. So the
Yeah.
way I usually frame it is that none of the parents that I interviewed felt better about the adoption over time.
Mm-hmm.
Almost all of them felt much worse. Worse is sort of a poor term, right?
Subjective. Yeah.
It's more critical of what had happened to them, less hopeful about what adoption meant for them and their child. They were continuing to struggle with those things that they didn't necessarily have that perspective on when they were closer to the adoption. There were a few who didn't feel worse because they had already felt pretty critically the first time I interviewed them.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were, I think, maybe two women that I would say were positive at both points in time when I talked to them. But what I think is really important about, and I talked about this one woman's story in detail, because she was probably the most positive person that I talked to at the 10-year follow-up. I talk about her towards the end, and she had a very unique relationship with her daughter and her daughter's adoptive family. One of the questions I asked really early on in the interview for mothers who are in open adoptions and still in any contact with their child is, when was the last time you saw your child? And the answer that she gave was, when did I last see her? I think I haven't seen her for about a week. But, I saw her adoptive dad just a few days ago because my husband and I bought a TV and her dad has a truck. And so we borrowed his truck to go pick up the TV. And, I tell this sort of obscure story in detail because she's talking about her daughter's adoptive family the same way that I might talk about like my brother-in-law, right? She's talking about a familial, comfortable, informal relationship with her daughter's adoptive father, the same way that we all talk about people in our broader kinship networks, in a way that wasn't contingent on an interaction with her child, right? And so she was really fully a part of their family. She saw them regularly. She had good friendships with both of her daughter's adoptive parents. She had gone on vacation with them. She regularly saw her daughter without the adoptive parents present. She told me one story about her daughter when her daughter was, I think, 10 or 11 years old. And her daughter came up to her, I think Meg, I call her in the book, and said, "Oh, can I call you mom?" And Meg said, "We have to ask your other mom," because she knew that her daughter's adopted mother would be like, "Yeah, call her mom if you want." And her daughter tried it out for a little while and then wasn't really into it and kind of just went back to calling her by her first name. But what you see in just that anecdote is the sense that Meg's motherhood wasn't a threat to her daughter's relationship with her adoptive mother. Meg knew that. She knew she could anticipate how her daughter's adoptive mother would respond. She felt very comfortable saying that. And so no one's motherhood is a threat to anyone else in that interaction. These are all very unique things, right? The idea of being part of a broader kinship circle around the child, the idea that no one is a threat to someone else's parenthood in this scenario, this level of trust and care for each other. But what was most important about this story, even as she's sharing all of these really promising stories of what the adoption looks like for her, was that she said there's nothing about the system of adoption that guaranteed this outcome for us. I got very lucky. My daughter got very lucky. She has phenomenal people who are raising her, who are very welcoming and inclusive of me in her life. You cannot plan for that, right? You cannot create policy to guarantee this outcome. And so, even though she felt very comfortable in the adoption, she was still deeply critical of adoption as a system. The amount of money that was involved, the lack of counseling that she had received during her pregnancy, the lack of support she felt she didn't get after the adoption occurred. And so, even in that good outcome, what she might classify as a good outcome at both times that I spoke with her, and who knows where she'll be another 10 years, right? This could change again. But even for someone who felt positively about their individual situation, she was still very cynical about the practice of adoption and how it works. And she said, I would never recommend this to someone else who is facing a crisis pregnancy or a crisis during a pregnancy. I would never suggest that they do this. It just happened to work out well for me.
Yeah. The parallels really struck me as I was reading your book, because what you cover here is sort of tangential to the world that we focus on at the imprint, which is really child welfare and
Yeah.
youth justice systems and stuff. But it was a really striking parallel to the conversation that is emerging around disrupted adoptions from the child's experience, right? We are
Right.
seeing that I think pretty much anybody would agree the least amount of resources from the feds on down really flow to that post adoption services section.
Right.
We have lots of other services in other parts of the continuum. There's like very little requirement that get invested in, and we still don't really have good federal numbers or any sort of data on like how often it happens. I think the USA Today piece from a few years ago they did a great job data mining.
Yeah.
And I think the good news was it's a relatively low occurrence. It's in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't happen all that often. When it does, it's very bad. And it is in this, what I would describe as like a ticking time bomb sort of way that's hard to ensure people have their eye on. It's not like
Yeah.
a child gets adopted and then it's next month that the trauma hits or that there's challenges that they face. It's 5 years later. And we just are
Right.
not very good systemically at controlling for something that happens years later. And I
Well,
felt I
and
had that in my head as you were talking about, 10 years later, how
yeah.
people's views change.
I think what's important is that most of the mothers did feel like very profound grief right after the
Mhm.
adoption. But that was viewed by them and the people around them, and it often was somewhat temporary. That was viewed as the mourning period. And there was the idea that this is ultimately going to be the best decision for everyone involved. And when they didn't move past that period, so you can be grieving but still be very optimistic. You can still be grieving but still believe this was the best decision, which is
Yeah.
what I heard a lot. But it wasn't until they saw how adoption was failing to deliver on what it had promised for them and their child 10 years later that they realized how poorly they had been treated really during the course of their pregnancy and during those years. But I do want to go back because I actually think that the ways that private adoption intersects with child welfare and family policing and the public adoption system are are important and are kind of increasingly important because when you look at the history of private adoption, it was historically very white, right? This was about an industry that really targeted young white women and girls experiencing their first pregnancy. They were not married. I mean, the vast majority of them were not married. And adoption was a way for them to delay motherhood until they could be in sort of a more appropriate time of their life. And so this was already a way of policing who gets to parent in a certain way, but it was also rooted in a market demand that centered on white children and really middle class women and girls. And that was true before Roe v. Wade, kind of into the 80s and early 90s. And then domestic adoption was kind of swamped temporarily by international adoption, which has really subsided. And now most adoptions in the United States are domestic adoptions.
Yeah.
And I think that what we have seen now with the increased market focus on domestic adoption again is that those things that were true about who was targeted a generation and 2 and 3 ago are no longer true. So we are seeing far more women of color being targeted by the private adoption system now. And because the unifying characteristic is really poverty for who is participating in private adoption.
You say targeted. What do you mean by that? Can you expound?
So domestic adoption is really a market-driven system, right? There is extraordinarily high demand for adoptable children, particularly adoptable babies. There are up to 45 families who want to adopt for every infant that is available. When you have, in a capitalist society, a market-based system with high demand, you create all of these players that are incentivized to generate supply. And this is uncomfortable language to use when we're talking about human beings, but that's really what you've done. And so you have these adoption agencies, you have for-profit advertisers and child brokers and other intermediaries that are highly incentivized to find vulnerable pregnant people that they can sell on the idea of adoption. And so you see this through targeted advertising, you see this through geofencing. So the example I give is, I looked at a database that shows you what search terms agencies are buying Google ads for, right? And so you'll see adoption agencies that are buying Google ads to show up as results on searches like, support for a single pregnant mom, California. You might start that search has nothing to do with adoption, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or if you're searching for how to get on WIC in Los Angeles, you might start getting ads for adoption agencies based on these searches, even though you're not searching for anything to do with adoption. You'll also see a lot of agencies purchasing ads on any search having to do with abortion, right? If you're looking for an abortion clinic, you're going to start getting ads for adoption agencies. Adoption agencies will also buy advertising based on your location. So that's the geofencing. So if you go to an abortion clinic, if you go to a methadone treatment clinic, if you go to a public hospital and you're pregnant, then you're going to start getting ads for these adoption agencies. And so when I say targeted, I really do mean targeted in a very key way. But I also think that what they are being targeted with is this idea of adoption as inevitably what is best for a child, inevitably going to provide a path to safety, security, stability for both the child, and usually the idea is that that will apply to the birth parents as well. And so just this constant idea that adoption is a social good that's going to accomplish this for people. And I think that for a lot of people who are pregnant, and I should go back for a moment, because it's important to understand that most mothers who relinquish infants want to parent. Very few of them wanted to have an abortion or tried to get an abortion. Almost all of the women that I interviewed continued their pregnancies with the intention of raising their child. And that's why I don't always say that these were like crisis pregnancies or unwanted pregnancies, because a lot of times they were very happy to be pregnant, but they faced a crisis later in their pregnancy, late, third trimester at or after 20 weeks, it usually is the idea that they couldn't come out of. So maybe a partner left them, so they lost that form of support. Maybe they were living with their parents or a roommate, they got kicked out. Maybe they were facing houselessness or whatever, they lost a job, something that introduced a level of instability that they could not find their way out of before the baby was born. And that level of vulnerability is what led to the adoptions in the first place. And that's why I think that this is not as separate from the child welfare system as historically it was, because historically it was very different. And I think that both of those institutions, those forces are increasingly converging, where we view family separation through child welfare and foster care and public adoption and through private adoption as a way of addressing a need, as a way of, purportedly caring for children, rather than creating any kind of social safety net that would allow parents to care for their children the way that they want to.
You mentioned this in the book. I'm not sure you put, specific years behind it, but you, in kind of setting up what you're going to write about, mentioned that, there's in recent years, sort of on average, 4 million births per year, a million abortions, and 19,000 relinquishments of newborns annually. So that difference is obviously pretty staggering.
Right. I mean, we're not, and I will say it's hard to quantify, because when we're talking about private domestic adoptions of infants, the most common type of private adoption is a step parent adoption, which is quite qualitatively different than what I'm talking about. And so kind of parsing out like exactly this experience that we're talking about of terminating one's own parental rights, at or soon after birth, like that's kind of this niche experience. But it is fairly reliably half of 1% of all births that we have.
Right.
So it's about that same proportion of women over the course of their lives. Whereas, 84 to 85% of American women will give birth at some point. So the vast majority of them are raising their children, and about 25% of women will have an abortion. Right. These are just not comparable numbers. So this idea that we have that adoption is the common ground in an abortion debate, that adoption represents a meaningful solution to people who are facing a crisis during pregnancies, that is not borne out in the numbers that we see.
The Guttmacher Institute does pretty much the annual surveillance, like figuring out
the surveillance
abortions, right? And their most recent report came out last month showing that abortions have actually increased each year since the Dobbs decision. That obviously belies the fact that these bans certainly have prevented many women from obtaining, the services they want where they're at. I guess two parts here. Are you surprised at that trend? And do we know anything about trends with relinquishment in these years since Dobbs? I mean, I think your own Turnaway study would have suggested that at least there'd be some increase at this time, but
and the Guttmacher data, because I think the Guttmacher data is actually an undercount, because the Guttmacher data does. Because the Guttmacher data right now isn't generating estimates for banned states. So if you live in Texas and you use telehealth care to get an abortion in Texas, they're not counting you, right? If you travel to New Mexico and get your abortion there, that counts as a New Mexico abortion, which it should. That's where the provider is, right? But they are, I would guess that their count is probably about 100,000 shy. So that abortions have gone up even more since Dobbs. I think there are a couple of things happening. I think one, the increase in the accessibility of telehealth and shield law abortion provision means that we are actually in some ways counting more abortions that were happening pre-Dobbs that we weren't counting, but we're capturing more of them. I also think the increase in philanthropy that happened right after the Dobbs decision, so the influx of money to abortion funds and practical support networks and patient navigation, meant that more people in these states might have actually been able to get the abortions that they wanted anyway. But I also think that when we look at the data from like Latin and South America, when they had very broad abortion bans and then legalization, it didn't really change their numbers either. It's very hard to, so the Turnaway study looks at relinquishment rates among people who are prohibitively denied abortion. And what we found is that among those denied access to abortion, 9% relinquished. So overwhelmingly, even among those who were highly motivated not to parent because they wanted to get an abortion, the vast majority of them were parenting after that denial. What is harder to track is, what does a prohibitive denial mean in the face of an abortion ban, right? We don't know. Right.
So
we don't know how many.
You would not construe a ban to be the prohibitive denial in that sense, because they could theoretically get it.
Because they could be traveling, they could be using a shield law, right? So that's what we don't know. I'm sure there are people out there who are not able to access the abortions that they want right now, but we don't know who doesn't try to get to the clinic. The Turnaway study was based on people who showed up at the clinic and could not get their care because they were over the gestational limit for that clinic or that state. What's harder to capture is who doesn't make it that far, who doesn't get to the clinic because of that ban, who in Texas says, I can't get to New Mexico, right? If they get to New Mexico and they can't do their appointment, that we can study, but it's harder to know who doesn't get that far in the process. And some of my colleagues are working on that research now.
And is there a good marker of private adoption? I mean, is there like annually able to see how many of these occur?
Oh.
Are they like tracking that?
No,
Not so much.
is the short answer. I mean, look,
Okay.
as someone who studies private adoption, I would love to have better numbers on this. But because of the muddiness of the types of experience that are all legally identical, right? The fact that step parent adoption is legally identical to an infant adoption to non-kinship adoption, they're quite hard to track. The National Council for Adoption attempts every few years to put together accounts of private adoptions that are happening. They parse that different ways. But I would also say that the National Council for Adoption is not a neutral player in this field. They are not primarily researchers. They are primarily a trade organization for adoption agencies in this country. And they are invested in a certain sense of what adoption can accomplish. So I use their numbers in my research because it's kind of the best we have. And I dig into their estimates a lot and try to parse what I think makes the most sense. But the bottom line is, no, we don't track this well. There's a federal bill last session in Congress called the Adoption Counts Act that would have just tried to count the number of private adoptions and then some very basic information about those adoptions so that we could say more definitively how many of these are happening. But no, we don't have great data on that.
You let readers know pretty early on here that, this research led you to a conclusion. I'm just going to read to you from just a very quick part that was really striking to me. I'm reading Gretchen's work here. Well, I did not set out to write a polemic. Is it polemic or polemic? I always get in my.
I say polemic,
okay,
but don't
good.
quote me
Me
on
too.
that. Yeah.
Me too. All right. Well, I did not set out to write a polemic. My commitment to listening to the voices of relinquishing mothers and adopted people and my belief in reproductive justice as the best way forward in our post-Dobbs world have both led me to understand the current practices of domestic infant adoption in the United States as anathema to that pursuit of justice. Now, that is a big statement.
Did I say that? Is that at the beginning of the book? I thought that was at
pretty
the
early on. You set the tone. I think you came back to it. You certainly came back.
I think
to it.
yeah.
Now so I guess, do you see any moral context for adoptions, even if it involved a very different process? Or are you entirely, are you out entirely on it existing as a private option for, mothers?
Well, I think a couple things. One is that, I stand by what I wrote, right? I believe that to be true. And it's easy to say, well, if private adoption were entirely different, would I feel differently? Yeah, sure. Like, who knows, right? I think there are a couple of core things that are irreconcilable with our current system of private adoption. First is that it inherently commodifies human beings. And I don't see a path to a just practice that is rooted in the commodification of children. The second is that it is contingent on a lack of reproductive autonomy. So if there is a mother out there who, if you removed the constraints of poverty, of violence, a lack of support, if you gave her a meaningful social safety net and she still would have relinquished her child, I haven't met her. I've talked to a lot of mothers who've relinquished, and I have not met one who, if you changed the material conditions that she was experiencing during pregnancy, wouldn't have chosen to parent. And maybe she's out there, but I do not believe that is the normative experience in adoption. And so as long as the practice of adoption is rooted in the commodification of children and the lack of reproductive autonomy, I do not see a path for it to be practiced ethically, which is different than saying that every mother, or person is prepared to parent every child to whom they give birth at any point in their life. I believe we need more systems of care for children who are vulnerable. Some of the mothers that I interviewed were unhoused or incarcerated at the time that they gave birth. They were going to need a longer time frame to find a way to parent their child safely or at all. But I don't believe that permanently legally ending their relationship is the best solution. I believe we need better systems of kinship care, community care. We need to value the work of caring for and raising children without the label of parenthood. We need to rethink what that looks like and what those systems of care could be. But I don't see a reason to legally end those relationships to children, to edit birth certificates, to sever that relationship entirely. I don't see a need for that. I do see a need for other ways of caring for kids. And whenever you say something critical about private adoption, people are like, oh, well, you just want kids to be in unsafe homes. The same thing about the child welfare system. Whenever you talk about how much policing is involved or how dangerous the child welfare system can be, people think then you want children to be in abusive homes. It's very much not what I want. But I think that is a very superficial way of thinking about what children and families need.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code podcast10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code podcast10 today.
I would say that sort of the main thesis I took away reading your book was to tell me if I totally missed the point. But I really thought you were it's a book about adoption and these mothers who participated and their experiences and their reflection. But in a way, it's sort of about the third path to me. I think your point, as I was taking it, was much was made during the oral arguments around Dobbs about Amy Coney Barrett's inquiry about, so I'm not going to go into exactly what she said, but couldn't adoption just be the replacement for abortion? So I took your point to be, if you think that is really going to happen, you're wrong. So let's talk about how to actually help parents parent, because that is what's going to happen. There's just going to be parents who may not have felt ready and now are going to parent. So I guess, you are pro-choice. For a policymaker or somebody of political influence who isn't and genuinely was seeking to meaningfully replace the option of abortion in some of these states with a ban, what would you recommend to them? Because I think you call out in the book that some of these states really have pretty fractious safety nets.
Yeah.
So what are the top recommendations from Gretchen Sisson?
My book is primarily written for people who share some fundamental values, right? I'm not trying to write the book for people who are fundamentally anti-abortion. And I'm also the other kind of pushback that I've gotten is people are like, oh, well, poor people just shouldn't have kids. And I'm like, okay, well, then then we're not sharing a worldview here. And then this isn't for you, right? I think you'll get something out of it if you read these stories, but that's not, I was really trying to target the book to a sort of left of center audience to challenge the way that even people who are very progressively minded tend to view adoption as this perpetual good and necessary good. But that being said, I do think that people who are anti-abortion, but take poverty seriously, take the reality of American poverty seriously, can get something out of this book. Because the bottom line, and this is also a call to people who believe in reproductive rights, but who aren't deeply in reproductive justice, who look at the fact that the number one reason for relinquishment is lack of money and resources. That's also the top reason women give for seeking abortion care. The reasons people get abortions are complicated. They usually have many, many reasons. They're all connected to each other. That's a socially acceptable reason to give for having an abortion. So why people report that, so I don't want to gloss over the complexity of that. But I will say that people across the political spectrum have accepted American poverty and chronic poverty as an easily acceptable reason for people to not have control over their reproductive lives. And that is where parenting and support for parenting becomes the common ground. If you want people to choose parenting, to choose to give birth when they are faced with a pregnancy that they didn't plan on or timing that they didn't choose, you need to make parenting possible. You can market adoption all you want. Texas is really trying, right? Texas is putting up billboards in all of these Black and brown communities where they deem people as at risk for seeking abortion care. They are advertising the heck out of adoption. It's just not going to be that appealing to people. Marketing adoption only works if you're talking to someone who's already deeply vulnerable. What is a better use of resources is to create conditions that allow people to feel that parenting is accessible to them. And that will allow people who are facing potential family separation to parent. It will allow people who might otherwise have considered ending a pregnancy to reevaluate the choices that are in front of them. That is the common ground. And I don't think that we have ever thought. So what's the policy agenda, which is what you asked, right? The policy agenda is, well, how do we create more affordable housing? How do we create access to affordable childcare at all, right? Spots for any of these things that would allow people's daily lives to accommodate a child. Those are going to be what is most key. I don't know. I mean, states that are anti-abortion also have the thinnest social safety nets, which leads me to believe that they're perhaps not as sincere in their values as they say they are. But that's my cynical take. And I think that and I speak me really as a part of someone who holds a progressive worldview, we need to stop letting them off the hook for that. So that's what I would say. That's the policy agenda.
Getting back to the actual experience of private adoptions for a second, can you talk a little bit about some of the things that really rose to the top for you about, what the women you interviewed said should be changed about the system? I mean,
yeah,
the system is here and it's not going anywhere soon. So what did they want to change about it, or what would have made it a better experience to the extent that's possible for them?
The number one thing that came up was the money that was involved in the practice of adoption. Given how expensive we think of it, private adoption is expensive, right? Families who adopt are paying tens of thousands of dollars. Most of those fees go to the agencies, but they're also sold packages of services for website design, for photographers and graphic designers who specialize in getting their adoptive parent profile ready, for search engine optimization, for social media ads. So you often see accounts, like Jim and Amy want to adopt, and they're buying ads, and they're on Instagram, on Facebook, right? So you come across these accounts, they're posting their profiles online, buying Google advertising. So it's not just the agency fees. Sometimes the agencies will broker to these paid intermediaries, but they're forking over a lot of money for that. And a lot of this is subsidized, right? So the federal government subsidizes the cost of adoptions. The federal adoption tax credit is up to $16,000 per adoption. So this is a commitment that our federal government has made to continuing to subsidize this market demand for children. This was the number one thing that mothers were critical of. And a lot of adoptive parents, and you'll see this come up a lot in conversations, is that the reason adoption is expensive is because some of these resources are going to supporting the pregnant, expectant mother during the pregnancy. Almost none of the women I interviewed had support from the agency during pregnancy. Some of them would have agency support in getting them enrolled on Medicaid because pregnancy is a qualifying event for Medicaid, even in states that have a very, very low threshold. And so the agencies would help them do that. And we do see an extraordinarily high Medicaid enrollment rate for mothers who end up relinquishing. It's almost 90%. One mother I talked with received housing support. She was unhoused at the time of her pregnancy. So she received 2 months of, they put her in an Airbnb for a couple of months. But other than that, they were not getting a lot of material support during their pregnancy, honestly, because if they were, they wouldn't. And I remember one mother told me this story of how she found out that the adoptive mother mentioned to her, like, oh, we had to send more money to the agency to cover some of your costs. And she said, I didn't see that money. Right. Like, I just want you to know, like, I didn't get that support. The adoptive parents talked about how they were so excited when they were flying out to meet the baby. They flew first class on their plane tickets out to pick up the baby because they were just in a celebratory mood. They took the upgrade. And she's like, I had the cost of the upgrade, the cost, not even the cost of the plane tickets, the couple $100s that they spent on the upgrade. If she had that money in her bank account, she wouldn't have relinquished her child. And so I think that a lot of them were really appalled at how much money was being spent and how much that was driving the process. Other sort of material reforms, most mothers don't receive their own counsel, their own legal counsel. The only lawyer in the room is the one that's paid for by the agency, either indirectly through the agency or directly by the adoptive parents. Most states do not require mothers who are terminating their parental rights to have their own lawyer present. Most of them did not understand the legal forms that they were signing. Many of them were signing very soon after birth. Some of them were still on medications after delivery. So a lot of them wish that they had more legal counsel around what they were signing when and what their rights were. Most of them did not receive options counseling during their pregnancies. No one sat down with them and made a parenting plan to say this is what parenting could look like. They certainly weren't given referrals for abortion if they were early enough in their pregnancies to be considering that at all. So they had very little support, very little information around them at the time that they were making those decisions. Almost none of them had support post-adoption. So there was one mother who the agency said, oh yeah, we provide counseling after the adoption if you need it. And she went to like 3 therapy sessions. And then the agency was like, well, that's all you have. And she said, well, you said you provided like lifelong services. And they're like, well, we have a support group that meets like quarterly, and that was their idea of lifelong support. They were also sold the idea of open adoption. So most adoptions in the US today are open to some extent. But what that means varies very dramatically. So again, I talked about the mother who was going on vacations with her daughter. I talked with mothers who were babysitting their children for the adoptive parents. But for others, that meant pictures that the adoptive family sent to the agency and the agency sent on to them. And they might not know their child's last name. They might not know the city where they live. Several of them didn't. One agency required 1 in-person visit a year. And so the mother took her in-person visit a year with her child. It was their tradition to go to a McDonald's. And so she would drive a couple hours and meet her son's adoptive family at the McDonald's, and they would have a happy meal, and she would watch her son, play on the playground there. But her son's adoptive parents hadn't told him who she was. And so I call her Kristen in the book. And so Kristen would show up to these visits and her son would just think like, oh, that's a friend of my mom's, right? And those visits were painful for her, right?
Sure.
She had to usually take a day off of work when she got back from one. But she wanted to show up because she wanted her son to know who she was, to have access to his family of origin. She wanted the openness to be of benefit to him. And she said, if he doesn't even know who I am, he's not getting that benefit. Why am I putting myself through this? And so this idea of openness is kind of introduced as this idea that the expectant mother is in the driver's seat. They get to determine how much contact is being had. But openness agreements very, very rarely have any legal enforceability to them. And very few mothers understood that because they don't have their own legal counsel to teach them on that. And
that
even in
fairly narrowly what I would call open, what you just described.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, but But that's the thing, is that when you use the term open to describe getting pictures twice a year from the agency versus, going to family dinners once a week, when that's all considered under the umbrella term of open, right? There's this mismatch, because agencies will often share these very rosy stories of very fully connected open adoptions, when that's actually quite rare. And adoptive parents can cut off a birth parent at any point, right? The birth parent doesn't have legal rights. And even in some states where there might be some enforceability to an openness agreement, usually you have to go to mediation, or you have to go before a judge to try to get visitation to the child you've relinquished. And it is going to be astonishingly rare, one, that a birth mother has the resources to find a lawyer to go before a judge to push this case. Two, that a judge is going to look at a fully completed valid adoption and tell the adoptive parents that they are obligated to provide visitation. So if they say, we don't feel safe around this parent, or they're not in a stable place in their life, we don't want them around our child, then they're cut off. They have every right to cut off. They are the parents. They are fully the legal parents, of course. And so a lot of mothers pointed to that, the idea that they didn't understand what openness was. They weren't counseled around it. They didn't have support for it after the adoption was completed. And they didn't realize the extent to which that wasn't enforceable. So certainly money was the number one thing. There's too much money in the system, lack of awareness of their legal rights and their pregnancy options, and lack of understanding about what openness really meant. Those were really the big practices that most mothers pointed to as really wanting to change about the system of adoption.
As we've been talking about, this book focuses on private adoption. So you really only peripherally touch on child welfare a little bit. But, one thing I thought was kind of interesting really right away post Dobbs was I kind of just started to pick up indicators from people of varying ideology in the child welfare. There was almost certainty for very different reasons that foster care was going to go up. And you would see legislative you'd see some conservative legislators, packaging these post-op bills around we need more resources for foster care. But then you also had people who were very critical of the child welfare system who also agreed, because of their view of the system that we have. So
there was never any evidence for that. So when we look at the Turnaway study, and for folks who, I know we mentioned it earlier, but the Turnaway study really looked at people who were denied abortions. What happened to them over 5 years of their life? Most of them parented. Again, 91% of people who were denied abortions were parenting. But we did not see any increased involvement of foster care in the lives of those women. Now, we only followed them for 5 years.
Did you look for that?
Yeah, we looked who had custody of the child.
I see. Okay.
And there was no increased rate of anybody else having custody of their children over control. I think people fundamentally, now I think that could change. Again, we only tracked them for 5 years. That's a fairly short. It's long for research, but it's short in someone's life and the way things can turn out, right? Things could change after that. I also think that there is an increased risk of parenting in poverty when you have given birth after abortion denial. And we know that poverty puts people at increased risk for family separation. There's also the idea that maybe you have the capacity to care for one more child than you planned on. But what is the cumulative impact of abortion bans if someone is repeatedly denied an abortion and they maybe have 2 more children than they intended, 3 more? Where is there a tipping point at which they're no longer able to care and family policing might. Right. And there's also the idea that if you're seeking abortion and an abortion is criminalized behavior, then are you inviting more surveillance? And I don't think we've seen any evidence of that. And I don't mean to make myself sound like I'm not putting on my tinfoil hat right now, but I think that is something that could happen. I wouldn't be shocked if it did, but I don't have any evidence to suggest that it is thus far. So I think that it's not out of the realm of possibility that abortion bans will have an interactive effect with child welfare. But I don't think it's as straightforward as people believed that it would be. And I think that that's because I do not believe the child welfare system is actually about caring for children who need care, right? I believe the family welfare system is largely about policing vulnerable families and families of color, and particularly Black families. And so there might be an interactive effect, but I don't believe that, because we have more people parenting in poverty who need support, then we're going to see an increased involvement in child welfare, because I don't believe child welfare is rooted in how we actually support vulnerable families.
What did your interview subjects, these birth mothers, have to say about CPS and child welfare? Did they talk to you a lot about that? Was that a fear or a thing in their mind as they calculated
for some of them? So all of the women that I interviewed relinquished to the private system. So some of them also had involvement with child welfare, but not that wasn't the reason why I was talking to them. So it came up in two ways. One is that if they had older children in foster care and were pregnant again, many agencies would target them and would say, you've lost older children to foster care. You are at risk of having this child being taken into foster care. But if you do choose a private adoption, then if you voluntarily relinquish, then you can choose the adoptive parents. You can have an open adoption, again, which isn't legally enforceable, right? But this was sort of presented as a way of maintaining more control. So that was one way that we saw it come up. The other way was that the threat of CPS shaped people's understandings of their pregnancy options. So I tell in the book one story of a woman named Camille, whose story was complicated, and I included it in depth in the book. But basically, Camille was suffering from postpartum psychosis after the birth of her third child. And a Black woman, she didn't have a partner. Her ex-husband, who was her co-parent for her older children, had passed away during her pregnancy, which was probably part of the reason why she was struggling with this mental health crisis. And she was very worried that as she was dealing with this crisis, the psychosis, which she knew she wasn't a safe parent for that baby, she was very worried that if CPS became involved, that she would lose custody of all three of her children. And so she ended up relinquishing the baby through private adoption because she did not want to attract the attention of CPS. And so I think that for her, this was a way of maintaining custody of her older children while she sought treatment and found a path to wellness. And again, her story is very complicated, so it's sort of a high level. But I think that was really how CPS kind of popped up, right? Is the targeting of people who have already been impacted by child welfare and family policing, and the sense that this threat of child welfare changed the risk calculus for some mothers.
You talking about this really clicked something for me about another part of the book that really, as somebody who focuses on child welfare stuff, really was interesting, which is the anecdote you have about I think it's a program at Oregon that really talks and does counseling around this as like preventative of child welfare involvement, and actually counseling, birth mothers on this. And I read that thinking, like, who the heck would be receptive to that argument? Like, you'd have to be so certain of impending loss to the child welfare system to think that that was your best bet. But actually, what you just described makes total sense. If you've already had experience with the system and you're worried that whatever your circumstances are now, that could risk other kids. And I guess that does make sense.
There was just a story a couple weeks ago in the Philadelphia Inquirer, about this exactly, where in Philadelphia, the CPS was telling parents basically voluntarily give up your children or we're going to take them into foster care, right? There's this idea that the voluntariness of it, which I would put in quotes, so this is coercion, of course, right? Like, give us your child or we're going to take your child, right? The idea that you can maintain some dignity if you choose to voluntarily relinquish. I think this happens far more frequently than we see.
Voluntarily relinquished to the foster care system, or voluntarily relinquished to private in that case that you were just saying?
Yeah, in that case, it was that you volunteer, but it involved the termination of parental rights into the child welfare system.
I see.
But I will also say, sometimes the line, like in some states, the lines between public and private are actually very fuzzy, right? And oftentimes, like private agencies will also contract to manage adoptions. Once children are available for adoption, the child welfare system, that will actually be managed by a private agency in some cases. Or when children are, the idea of safe haven babies, right, who are abandoned and then turned over to child welfare, technically they technically become, a ward of the state. The state is technically their guardian, but those adoptions are almost entirely managed by private agencies as well. And so sometimes this line between what is public and private, particularly for infants, is very fuzzy.
How do you feel about safe haven laws in the context of what we've been talking about here?
Safe haven laws came out of the anti-abortion movement, right? The premise of safe haven laws is that they are preventing abortion and infanticide. We do not see any evidence that is what's happening, but they're notoriously difficult to study who's actually using safe havens because they're premised on anonymity. I mean, I think that the potential for abuse with safe havens is you don't know who's dropping off that child, right? You don't know who is consenting to having that child dropped off or who is carrying power. And I think the closest corollary that my research offers is mothers who relinquished after giving birth, right? Who didn't have an adoption plan. Maybe they didn't know they were pregnant until they went into labor. I had a couple of those, or until very late in their pregnancy, or mothers who gave birth and then contacted an agency. And to be clear, more mothers contact an agency after birth than contact an agency in the first trimester by like a massive margin. So the idea that like they're choosing between abortion and adoption, more of them have a baby than have legal access to abortion at the time that they're contacting an agency. So if we look at that corollary of mothers who contact an agency to relinquish after birth, they were in some of like the most desperate circumstances, right? They had an abusive partner and they said, I cannot bring this baby safely home. Or they were unhoused and didn't have anywhere to go when they left the hospital. They didn't have an idea of what to do. And I think that those mothers are probably most similar to the mothers that would use a safe haven law, assuming that it's the mothers who are using the safe havens and not the abusive partner who's taking the baby. Again, we do not know. And so to me, this is just a heightened vulnerability for people. And I think that the anonymity also denies any possibility of openness or connection. And we think of openness as a favor to birth parents, whereas the person who actually benefits the most from openness is the adoptee, is the child as they grow, having that connection to their family of origin. So it denies the child that as they grow, for sure. But also anonymity isn't possible. We live in a world where you spit in a test tube and you have access to your entire genetic history. Right. And so this idea that you can be anonymous not only is denying children the right to that connection to their family, but is also a false promise. And I think that that's really important to understand. I mean, the people who lobby for safe haven laws are always part of the anti-abortion movement because they want to believe that this is a meaningful alternative for women, whereas I think a meaningful alternative to women is actually supporting them and caring for their children, because that is what most of them want.
Last question, because I've kept you here for more than an hour now. I really appreciate the time, but you obviously made the decision to focus on birth mothers here in the book, but you did interview a few fathers, and you did suggest, towards the end of the book, that this is something that is ripe for more exploration. What did you learn from the fathers you interviewed about how they experience all this?
Yeah, I interviewed a few, and there's a reason I stopped interviewing fathers. One is that the fathers I interviewed were mostly still partnered with the mother, who had the woman who had relinquished, and so they were. If I interviewed them jointly or even separately, they were just very largely deferential to her experience. And because they were still in a relationship, they were in agreement on what had happened, right? And so I think that there is importance to understanding those stories, but I kind of wasn't capturing it in the interviews that I was doing anyway. And because I wanted to focus on this as a question of reproductive autonomy, the story of the pregnant birthing parents were where I ended up focusing. But I do think that some of what the mothers told me opened a window into father stories that I think is really important. So some of these women knew that they were not likely to get the consent of their partner for the adoption. And so a judge might say, or the agency might say, just tell the judge you don't know who the father is, right? To avoid that. Or tell the judge you were assaulted so that you can avoid that requirement. This also came up a lot when fathers were tribal members, when fathers were Native American, so that they could avoid the Indian Child Welfare Act being invoked. Oh, just say you don't know who the father is. And so you see these ways of undermining fathers' rights. There are also certain states that require less paternal notification and have fewer paternal rights. And you'll have agencies that move mothers to those states to give birth so that they can use these adoption-friendly laws to avoid paternal involvement.
So fathers are frequently viewed as a hindrance to the wheels of adoption moving forward.
Yes. And I will also say, like, some of the mothers I talked with were like, yeah, he wasn't going to consent to the adoption, but he also wasn't going to help with parenting. Like, he just wanted me to single parent, but he wasn't actually offering any substantive support, either emotionally or materially or, what have you. And so there were also some probably abusive partners that were present in these stories that would have used the lack of consent as a way to control their partner. I can't parse that because I didn't interview them, right? But I can say, one, fathers' rights were being undermined, and two, fathers were using their lack of consent as a way of controlling their romantic partners. And there is more research to be done there. I don't think I am the researcher to do it, but I think that there is definitely a lot going on there, and it's hard to know from the stories and the data that I collected.
The book is called Relinquished, The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood. Gretchen Sisson, thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you, John.
Thanks to sociologist Gretchen Sisson, author of Relinquished, The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood, for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elliott. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we'd really appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews, and you can visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. And you can always get us on email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.